Of course, we begin on this Monday with the countdown to the midterm election, now just 1 day away. Candidates spent the final weekend, of course, making one last push for undecided voters.
But the big story as we head into Election Day is early voting. More than 41 million people across the U.S. have already cast their ballot. That's 2 million more votes than were cast at this point in the 2018 midterms. It is a sign that enthusiasm in this year's election remains high before the polls even open tomorrow. 73% of both Democrats and Republicans have a high interest in this year's midterms. We have team coverage right now. Mark Murray will join us in just a moment with new NBC News polling data out. We'll also talk with Mike Memoli about President Biden and top Democrats out on the campaign trail. But we're going to start in battleground Pennsylvania, which is where we find NBC News correspondent Maura Barrett. Maura, good morning to you. So the two big races there for the Senate and for governor. Tell us where things stand in both those races in these final hours.
All eyes on Pennsylvania, right, Joe? The statistical tie between Democratic candidate John Fetterman and Republican candidate for Senate Dr. Mehmet Oz is really putting a lot of pressure on the state. There's a wider lead in terms of the governor's race. The Democrat has more of a healthy bump ahead of Republican opponent Doug Mastriano. But again, there is a lot of contention because with that Senate race, this could decide who controls Congress. And so voters are feeling that, the campaign are feeling that. We saw them crisscrossing the state in recent days. Former President Trump coming out for Republicans. You saw President Biden, former President Obama coming out for Democrats. Over the weekend, we spent the day with a few campaigns in the suburban counties around Philadelphia, yesterday, which is those key demographic of voters that turns the state purple very often. We caught up with gubernatorial candidate Democrat Josh Shapiro to talk about how he's feeling about the race right now. I also asked him how he's feeling about the extremist views and a lot of the election-denying rhetoric we've seen from his opponent and how he thinks that might affect his race when voters turn out tomorrow. I want you to hear some of our conversation.
We had a free and fair, safe and secure election in 2020, and I was sued 43 times by the former president and enablers like Doug Mastriano. And by the way, they went 0-43. I went 43-0, and we were able to have a secure election. I've been incredibly humbled of the sheer number of Republicans who have been willing to take off the red jersey and just put on the Pennsylvania jersey and do what's right, reject Doug Mastriano's dangerous extremism, and join our campaign because they understand our democracy and our freedom is at stake.
And so something that was interesting we saw yesterday that we did not see very often in recent months was Fetterman and Shapiro campaigning together in an apparent attempt, it seemed, to carry for Democrats Fetterman across that finish line because that race against Oz and that Senate race is so tight right now. Again, a lot of pressure leading up to Election Day tomorrow here in Pennsylvania, Joe.
So when it comes to that close Senate race, what is it you're hearing from voters?
Voters, because of that pressure, are feeling anxious. We heard it across the board from Republicans, Democrats, in between at campaign rallies across the state this week. And I want to hear from some voters on both sides of the aisle that we spoke to and kind of how they're thinking in their most important issues.
I'm a little bit nervous about it, for sure. Very nervous. I think I have the same opinion as most Trump supporters about what actually happened. Can't prove it, but I don't know.
Having a candidate in office that speaks for everybody and not just his own personal beliefs on a lot of issues. What's on the ballot is severe and important, and having a candidate who's actually listening.
I'd like to see mail-in voting go away. Obviously, the absentee ballots I don't have an issue with. You actually have to prove that you are who you say you are.
I don't know that I could ever see myself having an abortion, but that's my choice. And someone else should be able to have their choice. I shouldn't be able to tell someone, what their choice should be. So I'm really concerned about that.
Now, on top of the pressure of this race and who exactly voters will be voting for is the question of whether voters will accept the election results. Pennsylvania is one of those that is expected to take probably several days in counting. It takes them a while to count their mail-in ballots. You heard from several voters here their hesitancy around the election. There was a lot of debate from Republicans specifically around election fraud in 2020. Obviously, the state is doing as much as they can to ensure that people feel confident and are able to vote safely and fairly, but that is something that campaigns, voters are anticipating even after Election Day wraps up tomorrow.
Variety of issues pushing people to the polls. So, Maura, quickly, this is the last full day of campaigning. What can we expect there in Pennsylvania?
Well, the closing argument ads are up on TV. You turn on TV here, you cannot escape any of those political ads. Campaigns are all over social media. Surrogates coming out yesterday. Kerry Washington here for Democrats. We saw Republicans Susan Collins at a roundtable with Dr. Oz. There's several campaign events again across the state as they make their final closing arguments to voters to get them to rally for each of their sides. But we will be watching it closely here in Pennsylvania.
We know you will, Maura. All right, thank you so much.
All right, let's now bring in White House correspondent Mike Memoli with more on the big Democratic rally this weekend in Pennsylvania. Mike, good morning. Always great to have you with us. So we saw this significant joint appearance by these two presidents. What was their message to voters?
Yes, Savannah, this was a political reunion 2 years in the making. We hadn't seen Barack Obama, the former president, Joe Biden, the current president, together on stage at a rally since the late days of Biden's 2020 campaign. And it was a good energy in that room, a big crowd. And that was really the goal here, to try to fire up, to energize Democrats in the key battleground for control of the Senate there in Pennsylvania. And their message was really twofold. It was a real tag team effort to try to fire up Democrats by reminding them what President Biden has done in office and really what was at stake if Republicans take control. Let's see how that played out on stage on Saturday night.
Your right to choose is on the ballot. Your right to vote is on the ballot. Social Security and Medicare is on the ballot. There's something else on the ballot. Character. Character's on the ballot.
The good news is you have an outstanding president right now in the White House. He's doing stuff right now, solving problems right now with a Democratic Congress, and he can continue it if you vote.
Now, I know a lot of Democrats smile at seeing those two back together on stage. And it's been interesting as I've been talking to advisors to both men. They've been talking a lot behind the scenes together, talking by phone often, trading intel on what they've been seeing on the campaign trail. One of those conversations, I'm told, was about how tough it is to get their message out because of concerns about inflation. And I thought that's why it was so interesting. You heard President Obama there playing that role of validator, talking up Biden's record.
Absolutely. And interesting to hear how much they've been in touch behind the scenes. So we see them together right now, but they have both been campaigning separately. In fact, the former president has had rallies in these key battleground states, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan. But then our current president, Biden, has appeared in states where Democrats are leading. That includes New Mexico, California, New York. What's behind that strategy, and why was it important for them to finally campaign together in particularly Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I mean, Savannah, in 24 hours, obviously, as voters go to the polls, some of the key battlegrounds are the very same ones that we've been following throughout. And that's where we've seen President Obama spending these last 2 weeks in those 6 key races where Senate control is going to be determined. But one of the big storylines tomorrow night is going to be about Democrats playing defense on what should have been safe ground in these blue states. And that's where we've seen President Biden spending a lot of his time. He was in California. I was in Yonkers, New York. If you would have told me I'd be just outside New York City 2 days before the election, that's where I was with President Biden last night as he was campaigning with Kathy Hochul, the governor there. This is really going to be a key thing to watch tomorrow night. And it's why President Biden is actually closing out his campaigning just outside Washington today in Maryland. Now, it's a race, the governor's race there. Democrats want to win. They know they will win. The Democrat there has a strong lead. President Biden wants to end on a bright spot, and Maryland is going to be a bright spot tomorrow night.
Yeah, that's fair. All right, now President Biden is actually facing a similar situation to what President Obama saw in his first midterm election in 2010 in terms of approval rating. At the time, Obama had a 45% rating. According to the latest NBC News survey, Biden is at 44%. What's at stake right now for the president? Just help us put this in context.
Well, what we're going to see tomorrow night likely is a repeat of historical trends. That's what the White House is really emphasizing at this point. They don't want us to put too much stock in the fact that a bad midterm night for the president's party might spell political doom for him in potential reelection campaign in 2024. Look what happened to Clinton in 94. Look what happened to Obama in 2010. And it was really fascinating there in Philadelphia Saturday night to hear President Obama, talking about what he saw in his own first midterm race. Let's take a listen.
If we had kept the Senate in 2014, we'd have a very different Supreme Court making decisions about our most basic rights. Midterms are no joke.
So we heard President Obama talking about how he got his butt whooped in 2010, but also talking about how much more he could have accomplished Democrats, he said, pay too much attention to the presidency and not enough to these down ballot races.
All right, Mike Memoli, thank you so much.
Top reps for both sides made appearances this weekend on Meet the Press. The chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee was asked if Democratic messaging is effectively courting crucial swing voters, while the chair of the National Republican Senatorial Committee was pressed on whether he will accept the results of Tuesday's elections. NBC News Meet the Press moderator Chuck Todd has a recap.
There's a lot of blue state Democrats on the House level that are in these competitive seats, Oregon, New York, California. And I'm curious, do you think the abortion message doesn't work as well in blue states because voters don't believe it'll ever be illegal in their state? But it does work pretty well for some of your red state Democrats. Have you noticed this yourself?
Well, of course, when abortion is literally being taken away by an initiative like in Kansas, of course people are going to pay more attention. So the threats are real. If these guys control Congress, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to try to pass a national abortion ban. And bear in mind, 75% of the Republicans now in the Congress support a national abortion ban. That means California and New York and other big blue states are on the chopping block too. And so, of course, they want to disguise it and try to confuse or lull voters into a false sense of security. But when the wolf comes to the door, it's wearing sheep's clothing. And that's what voters in blue states need to understand.
You know, based on all of your answers to me, it sounds like you don't believe Democrats did anything wrong. You believe if you don't do well, it's simply you had bad messaging or you didn't communicate it right. Is that your basic take here?
First of all, neither you or I know what's going to happen on Tuesday, so what do you say we wait to see? But secondly, look, what I'm telling you is we're not perfect, but we are responsible adults who didn't attack the Capitol on January 6th, didn't try to whitewash it. We've got all kinds of things we can do better, but we are responsible adults who believe in this democracy and who are fighting for a better future.
Let me ask you about Arizona and New Hampshire. You didn't put them in your win category yet. You put them in there. You think you have a shot there. Coincidentally or not, those are the two seats that Senator McConnell's super PAC chose to pull out of and not invest in. In hindsight, was that a mistake?
Well, we've invested all along. If I was predicting now, I believe we're going to win both Arizona. I believe we're going to win New Hampshire.
Before I let you go, are you going to accept the results of all the Senate elections on Tuesday night?
Absolutely. But what we're also going to do is do everything we can to make sure they're free and fair. And if if there's any shenanigans, we're ready to make sure we support our candidates to make sure that these elections are fair and every ballot is counted the right way.
And our thanks to Chuck Todd for those conversations.
Let's continue the conversation with NBC News senior political editor Mark Murray, who's got one final NBC News poll ahead of Election Day, is here on set with us, where he will be quite a bit over the next few days, which we're very excited about. Mark, good morning. Good to see you.
Good morning, guys.
So out of this poll, I want to start with this pretty notable shift in enthusiasm with Democrats. So the poll found 73% of registered Democrats are now expressing, quote, high interest in tomorrow's elections. That's now even with Republican voters, and actually also erases a 9-point advantage that Republicans were seeing prior to this. What's your takeaway from this, and how do you think we will actually see this play out in terms of turnout, in terms of who's showing up and why?
Enthusiasm and energy plays out so much, is so important in midterm elections. Not as many people vote in a midterm as in a presidential. And often the big shellackings that we often see, Barack Obama talking about his in 2014, comes when the side that controls the White House and Congress just doesn't show up to vote. And the fact that our poll shows that Democrats are just as energized as Republicans is at least some comfort to Democrats to say, hey, maybe our folks turn out, that we don't end up getting the shellackings that former presidents have received in the past.
And I mean, President Biden's low approval rating is also one reason this seems like an uphill battle. But what is it specifically we're seeing with his approval among independents and then among voters in these real key swing states?
It really is the voters in the middle that are down on President Biden. As you ended up mentioning, overall, he's at 44% approval, but among independents is at 28%. Among voters in the important swing states of 2020, it's 40%. Those are not great numbers to be able to have. And so I was talking about the Democratic enthusiasm earlier. What we're seeing about Joe Biden and a lot of the dissatisfaction with the country are your traditional fundamentals that make it really tough for the party that controls the White House and Congress to maintain control.
We are, though, seeing the president poll pretty well with some minority groups, black voters, Latino voters, urban voters. And what do you think about that? How much of a help will that be? Is it enough to kind of keep a foothold in some places?
They're going to need everybody and probably more to withstand some of the forces at play here. And you're exactly right. African Americans and Latinos are backing Democrats on the ballot. They are putting President Biden's approval rating in the positive territory. But I'm actually, what's interesting, despite the 28% of independents who are down on President Biden in our poll also shows that Democrats are running even on the ballot with independents. And so if that trend continues, that could be a very good sign. But traditional midterm environments, it's usually independents break decisively for the party that's out of power.
So tomorrow, the American voters will send a message. But right now, what are the issues that seem to be on their minds as they're actually casting their ballots?
Yeah, Joe, it's the same messages we've actually had in our last several polls. Threats to democracy, #1, as voters say, is their most important issue, followed by jobs and the economy, and then the cost of living. It's important, though, to note that if you decided to put both economic buckets together and add up the jobs and the economy and cost of living, that ends up exceeding threats to democracy. But Republicans have been winning on the economic message, Democrats winning on threats to democracy, also abortion. And we're seeing all those forces play out in the TV ads and the closing arguments across the country.
And we just heard Maura's, the folks she talked to, everyone had something different that was bringing them to the polls.
Yeah.
So, all right. Mark Murray, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. We'll be seeing a lot of you. We appreciate your time.
And make sure to stay right here on NBC News Now for all of your Decision 2022 coverage. We'll have full team coverage of the critical races you need to watch with results and analysis throughout election night. That coverage kicks off tomorrow at 6 o'clock Eastern. And, of course, we'll have continuing coverage the morning after right here on Morning News Now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.